The World Health Organization has declared their highest level of emergency about monkeypox. How concerned should we be? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
The World Health Organization recently made a declaration of an emergency.
We have an outbreak that has spread around the world rapidly through new modes of transmission, about which we understand too little and which meets the criteria in the international health regulations. For all of these reasons, I have decided that the global monkeypox outbreak represents a public health emergency of international concern.
The Director General there of the WHO says that he's creating this, what's their highest level. And when they do that, that gives them power over things, and they can force other countries to do things based on the treaties. And he says that based on their regulations, but the reality is that their advisory board voted 9-6 against doing it because they didn't think it met it, but he decided to override what they were doing. So San Francisco has already declared an emergency. President Biden is thinking about declaring an emergency. I think the total number worldwide that have it now are something like 17,000, and 5 people have died of it. Should this be an emergency?
If you listen to what he said, he gave kind of 2 reasons. One of them was that it's transmitting through means that we don't know a huge amount about, and the other one was just that it's spreading rapidly, according to his definition. And then he said, for all of these reasons, and the only reasons he gave were those 2. So, the answer is we're really left to infer it ourselves, because the reasons he gave don't really make sense. Because like you said, they have their own internal regulations, they have their own policies, they have their own ways. The people who he would go to for an advisory board don't think it needs to be. This is just really a case of where you have to look at it and go, it's not for the reasons stated.
Right.
And I think that's pretty evident from what's going on. But he did have reasons. I think this is part of it, is it's not they're doing this for a real reason, and it's not necessarily some evil, nefarious reason in the sense of that they don't think of it as a nefarious reason, but there is something that is pressuring them to do this, and I think it's something that we should look at and kind of say, to the best of our ability, what can we pull out of this, because I think it really matters.
And I think we need to be concerned because, the World Health Organization, the CDC, they both got a huge amount of power, starting with the COVID epidemic.
So you're not saying we need to be concerned about monkeypox?
I'm not saying we need to be concerned about monkeypox. Thank you for clarifying that. But we need to be concerned about what they're doing, because you look at, my concern about what they're doing is they had this huge amount of power that was unprecedented, right? They locked down nations. They caused economies to crash. The World Health Organization did things, including they appear to have covered up stuff in Wuhan. They became a huge power player, just like the CDC did and just like Fauci did. And then all of a sudden you have that kind of die off and kind of disappears from the headlines. And I think we should be really concerned, because my guess is they want to get back on the headlines. They want to get back their power that they had for 2 years, and power is very addictive. And so I see them do this, and the arguments seem to be very, very weak.
And they may also be looking at it somewhat from the other perspective, because we may say that they were too quick to lock down, they were basing it on false data, on and on and on. There's other people out there who say they didn't act fast enough, and they didn't, their negligence caused people to die, and that they needed to go harder, faster on it. So, there's a potential that, why are they being more aggressive about it? Just to be fair to them, they are getting pressure from the other direction, saying, you need to be more on top of things. COVID, at least we were doing something about it, but we should have done it faster.
There was an article that was written right around the time that they were doing this, and it was interviewing other health officials, and several of them were saying, hey, one of the things that coronavirus did is it changed our method of kind of risk assessment and the level of risk that people are comfortable with. They said 10 years ago, they said 3 years ago, we would never have done this, but after the coronavirus, we're now saying we're looking to these health agencies to provide a coordinated attack to to direct things earlier, kind of like what you're saying. I mean, they were saying there has been a shift in the calculus that we're using because people are less comfortable with risk. And they're even acknowledging that their own view of risk has changed dramatically. And that's a really dangerous position to be in.
And I mean, it's interesting because you go to places now, and what surprises me is if you see people masked, at least in North Carolina, it's almost always young people. It's almost always people that have almost no risk, right? It's not the older people. It's especially the high school students. I see a lot of high school students that are masked. When, if they got it, the chances of them having any significant effect of COVID. But I think they've really created a generation that's scared to death and is a lot easier to frighten. Because, one of the things that I think that's just a blatant false statement that he makes is they don't understand transmission. They absolutely understand transmission because it's almost all in the homosexual community. Almost nobody outside the homosexual community has gotten this. They understand transmission. They're just pretending like they don't. Now, could it start to transmit a different way, even though it's been something that's been in African countries? My concern is he doesn't seem to be actually stating the facts that they know very well, because they do know how it spreads. Now, there could be other things that come up, but right now they know how it's spreading.
So is it possible that there's sort of a bit of double speak by saying they don't know how it spreads? What they really mean is, we haven't done double-blind studies, and so we don't have published results, even though you can connect the dots and say pretty realistically and rationally, we have an idea of what the transmission spread is.
And he goes on in that video, which we thankfully didn't watch the rest of it, but he goes on and he says, and this is why, because we don't know how it spreads, this is why men should stop having sex with multiple partners. So even though he says we don't know how to do it, in the same video, he basically corrects himself and says we do know how it's spreading.
Right.
And so, I understand it could be doublespeak or it could just be being deceptive.
Isn't doublespeak deceptive?
Yeah.
I mean, there are 2 children that have caught it. In both cases, they lived with, sodomites, with men. And they're very specific in their language. It's not just the homosexual community. They are saying it is men who have sex with men. And so they're being very, very, very particular in their understanding of who the audience is. And they've even made pains to point out the fact that in the case of the 2 children that caught it, they lived in a home with men who had sex with men. And so, so there's this, so again.
And that's very odd, because if they're going, we don't know how it's transmitted, then why would they investigate that? But that's the first thing they look for, is if it's leaving a very particular community.
Right.
There was a sex rave in Belgium, and there was one in Spain that was a homosexual sex rave. And it was like tens of thousands of people go to these things. And they all just have indiscriminate sex with each other. And then they come from all over the world and from countries, and they all tie it back to these 2 events.
Okay.
So somebody from Africa went there that had it, and it spread in these events, and then they went back to their home country. So they actually pretend like they don't know what the vector is, but they know what the vector is.
So it's even that's because I had actually had heard about that from a couple different places, but I didn't realize that was tied to the primary incidences. I thought it was just a continued vector, not the initial vector.
Right. And at first they were saying what I read today was that there were 2 of them that it was tracked back to, but both of them were basically large homosexual sodomite gatherings with indiscriminate, sodomy. And so because of that, it's spread across the world. And so it's very narrow in the communities that it's in.
When you see behavior that doesn't match past behavior, when you see behavior where they're pushing something harder, you kind of have to ask, what are the things that's causing them to behave prejudicially, in a sense? They're behaving in a way that doesn't match what their own standards of behavior are. So is it favoritism? Is it political pressure? But in the end, there's something causing this. There's something pushing this. And I think, there has been a history among health organizations in treating things that affect the homosexual community differently than when they affect the global community. That they would target things that, there are things that impact large communities, but they would still deal with the homosexual community in a different way than they would with 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 the general populace. And so, I mean, there's a real possibility that some of it is related to that.
And what frequently happens is that they keep saying sodomy is fine, right? That it's just a man's choice of whether he has a male sex partner or not.
Well, it's not a choice.
Well, I think they've gone back to being a
Oh, it's a
choice. They get
choice
very
now?
confused.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
for a while it was a gene that forced it. Now they're going back that it's not. Part of it is they know it's shameful. And so like this happened with AIDS, this happens with hepatitis B, this happens with multiple things, that even though they say this is just fine and normal, they also recognize that it's not. And so they kind of covered up, and they always want to say, but this is generalized. This isn't to just the homosexual community. Even though, in this case especially, hepatitis B, depending on the country you're in, that's not just the homosexual community. In the U.S. it largely is. But, so they want to broaden it and make it appeal to everybody, so everybody panics about it, so everybody wants to fund it, because if they just said it was for the homosexual community, enough people still go, ew, that changes their funding and changes what the response would be.
And if they say it's because the homosexuals have this disease, it sounds like, well, maybe someone sent a disease to the homosexuals, and that's not something that you want to be implying.
Right. And again, it's happened before. It's not like this is the first time that's happened. And it was like with the AIDS epidemic, the first thing that they did was they went, oh, heterosexuals can get it. It's just starting here, but it's going to spread out into the heterosexual community. We shouldn't think that it will stop here. This is not how it's going to spread. That just happened to be where it started. The language about the AIDS epidemic is very similar to the language about the monkeypox. Only monkeypox is a lot less serious. Let's be serious. Usually it's just a skin rash.
Right. It's I think it runs about 2 to 4 weeks. He said that currently I think in his address, 10% of those who have it have gone to the hospital. I'm not sure if he said admitted to the hospital, but there was some level of hospitalization, which worldwide that is very different than. It doesn't necessarily. It doesn't. I said I'm not sure that it means they've been admitted, but they've gone to a hospital for pain management for the rash. About 10% of those who have it. So that would be about 1,700 people out of 17,000. And so I think it was it 60% or so were in Europe, with like 30% in the U.S. somewhere around those numbers. So it's again, like you said, they know a lot about this. And you could even say this in one sense. There is probably a very real desire to say that if there is something that is affecting the health of homosexuals that is global, that it should be a global health concern. And there is a part of it where that's enough to answer the question of potentially why they do it, because they're saying homosexuality is an absolutely acceptable way of life, like you've already said. And so if this is affecting homosexuals, why wouldn't we say this is a global health concern? How could we not say it is, even though this doesn't match the standard of what they would do for many, many other things?
And it's a big deal because the World Health Organization can actually command countries to do things.
Right.
And so they can seize other people's resources for it. And when you think about it being 5 dead, 17,000 people have a rash. That's a shame. And 5 dead, it seems like to be able to usurping other nations' jurisdiction based on the treaty that they signed with WHO, that I'm surprised that nations aren't going, whoa, wait a second. What, you're going to now tell us that we have to redirect our pharmaceutical manufacturers to work on this? Because WHO has the right to do those kind of things. When they put it at their high, they have different emergency levels, and this is their highest emergency level. And so he goes on in that video and talks about how there's countries that have pharmaceutical companies. Well, they have to get involved now because we can command them to do that. So this is a very high-level response for what's going on when you consider how many diseases kill people compared to something that caused 5 deaths. It seems a very disproportionate response.
And this is another aspect of we've done other episodes where we talk about how the government has taken over scientific research, and this is just another aspect of that sort of attitude of going, we need to institutionalize these things where the government can force people to do things that they want to because of policy and because of what are frequently just very much political goals and political directives.
And to not be seen as doing something against the sodomite community.
Right.
When we talked before about the euphemistic treadmill, where the idea is at first they were called sodomites, then you call them gays, then you call them homosexuals. Now they've taken another step with that, men who have sex with men. And they constantly shift it as it gets the baggage from people realize that the disgusting behaviors associated with that term. And so it constantly shifts. And so we've seen that shift happen. And I do think it's important to use the term sodomite because that's more of the biblical term. I mean, it's a grievous sin in the sight of God because it's about denying the existence of God. And so, that's part of when you look at what WHO is doing, you should also, and San Francisco and President Biden's talking about doing it, it is about Romans 1, right? It is about the idea that when God turns you over, this is what it looks like. When you don't want to retain God in your knowledge, this is what it looks like. And so I do think there's an aspect that they're fighting against that. So it takes a higher priority in terms of healthcare than things that would have a lot broader impact, because it's a pretty narrow impact that this will have.
I mean, it's a pretty narrow impact. And on top of that, it's a story that has gotten a whole lot of play in the news much prior to the WHO making this proclamation. I mean, I had no idea until we were gearing up to do this podcast how few people actually had this disease relative to the number of headlines that I've seen about this.
And at first, none of the headlines mentioned that it was about sodomy.
No,
now they're
not
starting
at all.
to, but at first it didn't mention that at all, or men who have sex with men, to use the euphemism. But
but the fear that they've generated has actually impacted a lot of people. I mean, and like you're talking about the
I've
amount
had
of
conversations with people at my office who are afraid about it. And
right, or should be worried about monkeypox.
well, now you know how to explain it for them to avoid it.
But if you, and even in, like you said, even in the articles, it was they're not really trying to calm people's fears down because they're leading off with, for all we know, this will jump to the broader population. And so there's this part of it where, as scientists, they have no reason. They literally have no reason to believe it will jump to the broader population. Zero reason at all. I mean, if anybody has any reason like that, no one has voiced it, no one has suggested it, no one has given any inkling of any data that they have to make them think that is likely in any way whatsoever. But they're saying, this could jump to the This could just happen at any given moment, so we have to deal with this. And the truth is, like I said, there's lots of diseases that are a lot more dangerous if they did that they have just as much reason to fear, and they're not doing anything about those.
For all we know, our cats could turn evil all at once and try to kill us.
Right. I mean, while also getting the new monkeypox disease
and
giving us monkeypox and Ebola, and let's just there's no reason to believe those things. And so one of the articles was covering people going, I'm just getting over the fear of coronavirus, and now this crops up, and I've been up at night, and I've been worrying about the, it's like, and
that's why, in my opinion, WHO is doing it because it is part of it, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is it's a way to continue their power and continue to have a significant influence, as opposed to, the CDC got really powerful during AIDS and then it dropped off. Well, they're trying not to have that happen this time.
Right.
In WHO. And it is really important to recognize another aspect of this, and this has to do with the hepatitis B vaccine. The hepatitis B is, in America, it's a homosexual disease, just like monkeypox. Almost nobody gets it, with the exception of people that are in the sodomite community. I mean, even on the CDC website, it says, experts recommend that all gay and bisexual men be vaccinated for hepatitis A and B. The hepatitis A and B vaccines can be given separately or as a combination vaccine. The vaccines are safe, effective, and require 2 to 3 shots within a 6-month period, depending on the type of vaccine. What they don't say now is all infants within 24 hours of birth get the first shot. They're not at risk, but they get the first shot within 24 hours if they're at a hospital. And then there's take one after, I forget, like 6 months, and then, or after 2 months, and then after 6 months later. Why are they giving all these vaccines to all those children? Because they're going to grow up to be homosexuals?
Out of an abundance of caution.
And the reality is that if you just did it for 1% of the U.S. population, vaccines are really expensive, especially if you can't get that many of them to do it, because homosexuals aren't renowned for their care about their health. You know, the average life expectancy, I know at least 30 years ago, the average life expectancy for a homosexual was 30 years less than it was for anybody else. I mean, they tend to live very high-risk lifestyles. And that matches what Scripture says about the wages of sin. But, you know, one of the reasons that they push on all the children, because if you're vaccinating, you know, giving the vaccines to, 100 million people, the pharmaceutical company makes a lot more money and has a real incentive to develop a vaccine, and the per shot goes way down, so the homosexuals have more of a desire to get the shot. And so they like to broaden it and say this applies to everybody, even though there's no evidence that it applies to everybody, because it has certain economic advantages to doing that. And so when we hear about vaccine, and that's where they're going with monkeypox, we need to have monkeypox. I think there already is a monkeypox vaccine. We need to get everybody vaccinated with it. No, everybody doesn't need to be vaccinated with it. The side effects of vaccines tend to be pretty significant, while the death rate of this is 5 out of 17,000 of people that have a high-risk lifestyle. I mean, should we be giving the vaccine to everybody? No, but are they likely to push that?
Let's be really specific. When you say that the vaccines have a high-risk rate, what you mean is when you give it to 100 million people, there are going to be more than 5 people that die.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't mean that there's going to be 1 million people that die, but you're saying in the end, I mean, I'm
saying the risk reward isn't
right,
good. Most people will get it and have no effect.
Most people just don't have that sense of numbers. When you say something, there's only deaths of 0.0001%. Well, guess what? You multiply that times 1 million, and that turns into that's turning into a much larger number of people that most people think. Then you do it if you did it worldwide, and you did it. I mean, if you actually gave it to 1 billion people, how many people would actually die? And again, this is for something that they had almost no chance of dying from in the first place. Or if they were, they could elect to get it. It's certainly not something that that they have to be given this at birth. And so when you think about these decisions, there's just part of it where people go, well, better safe than sorry. No, the answer is it is not better safe than sorry. It is less safe, and there are people who are they're going to die for no reason.
Right.
Or not for no reason, I should say. They're going to die for a very bad reason.
And you're not an anti-vaxxer.
I'm not an anti-vaxxer at all. I'm just, in the end.
And the hepatitis A vaccine, since I just got it recently, I wish I would have had the vaccine before I got it.
Right.
Hepatitis that is not a homosexual disease.
Right. If you're going to go to a third world country where they don't have sewage handling systems and things like that, then hey, have a hepatitis A vaccine makes a lot of sense, and you would have gladly paid $2,000 for it.
After the fact, when I knew how bad it was, I would have. Before the fact, nah.
It is one of those things where the Scripture says before you do something, you count the cost, and the cost here does not make sense. And most people just don't have a sense of the numbers. They just look at it and go, "What's the harm in giving a vaccine? Vaccines are safe, and vaccines are relatively safe, And that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
And what you're saying is, hey, here's a disease that has infected a very small number of people, and a tiny number of people have died from it, and it's pretty obvious the mode of transmission of this disease.
And it's a very narrow community that's impacted.
And so from all of that, it doesn't follow that we all need to get vaccinated.
Right.
When you're doing this, you're not doing calculus anymore. You are not doing math anymore when you're saying that this,
because the math would make you look horrible.
The math makes you look pretty bad if you're basing this on math. I mean, the math for COVID was better than this.
Yes.
But something like this, you think, okay, so if it's not math, what is it? What's the motivating factor? And it's like, okay, well, power. We ran out of steam with the last disease, but we found out we had a lot of power. By selling fear.
By selling fear. And the other thing is they also recognize that the homosexual community has a lot of power. I mean, and it has a lot of power in worldwide politics now. And that should concern us, and it should cause the church to ask, why does it have so much power? The homosexual community. I mean, you look at what's happening with the drag queen shows for children and all this just unbelievable behavior that is happening in our country, and just recognize that this is because of the power of the sodomite community.
And even if it's not power in one sense, it's at least power in the sense that they can do this and no one can question the decision.
Well, but the government frequently is promoting these things. The government is afraid to do anything, right?
I'm just saying at a minimum, I mean, this it's really bad for something to not be able to be questioned because of, it's like, oh, this guy, he's, what is it? Everybody knows there are these political things where if you raise a question about it, all of a sudden, who here doesn't care about mothers? You know what I mean? And all of a sudden, if you raise, but I mean, is this good? All of a sudden, you're questioning mothers? And they're just going to steamroll you. And there's just part of it where, even beyond, it's just an unquestionable area. If they say they're doing it for the homosexual community and you want to raise your hand, they're going to go, what, you hate homosexuals? Is that what you are? You hate, you're a homophobe. And so it's even at a minimum, it's just a means to just shout someone down and destroy them for even questioning the decision.
And, the U.S. Senate right now is debating a bill about codifying Obergefell into law, basically saying that no state can refuse to have two men marry or two women marry, because of Justice Thomas's note on Dobbs, where he said, basically, if you accept this, we should rethink some other things where they made up laws out of whole cloth. They just made it up. And my guess is most for the reason you just said, that it will probably get, this may not happen, but it will probably get Republican votes sufficient to pass it.
Right.
Because they're afraid to say anything. So often you just look at what happened with AIDS, you look at what happened with COVID, and what the CDC always goes to is vaccines rather than therapeutics. And that's what they're talking about with monkeypox. The reality is therapeutics tend to be faster to develop, and they tend to be more effective. But they tend to, you can't sell 100,000 or 100 million of them.
Right.
And so,
because the only people who buy therapeutics are people who actively have monkeypox.
The disease. What they'll say is, well, there's something like 1,500 people that had it 3 weeks ago. And now in the U.S., there's almost 3,000. That means in 3 more weeks, it will be 6,000 and 12,000. And soon the whole country will have it.
Right.
And so we need to get the vaccine out there now, as opposed to going, well, let's do a therapeutic and let's just treat it and you don't worry about it. But yet that's never, and I would argue that in the AIDS epidemic in particular, Fauci killed a lot of people by refusing to do any studies on therapeutics, because basically he refused funding of any therapeutics. He said vaccines are the only way to go. And so it was delayed something like 10 years. And so a lot of people died of AIDS that didn't need to, because in the end there was never a vaccine developed. All that they developed was therapeutics.
Yeah, and it's just such an odd approach, because AIDS is, the HIV virus is almost constantly mutating, and because it has so many different forms and changes, it's impossible, basically.
You mean it's kind of like COVID?
Well, it's with conventional methods, it's really hard to come up with any kind of vaccine that's going to imitate that virus well enough for your body to produce the antibodies it needs.
And that wasn't late knowledge. That was early knowledge.
This is something that was talked about in my freshman level biochemistry classes, that this is why it's a really hard thing to do.
And one of the things that I think, again, I was kind of saying earlier, is most people don't think in terms of percentages. They don't think in this term. But when you work at the federal level and you work at federal level of policy, you are always aware of the fact that decisions you make mean people are going to die. It's not even something you can remotely even get away from. There's this part of it where there's just, if in this, they knew with the coronavirus, anytime you roll out a vaccine, a certain number of people are going to have a negative reaction to it. And I don't mean like they even have to have this hostile sense of thinking about it.
Every time they build a road, they know people will die on that road,
right,
too, right?
Right.
It's not even that it's negative or that you're trying to kill people. It's that it's just the reality that If you do things, there's consequences.
And so they're always weighing these sort of percentages. And so there's this, but they know that the populace doesn't think in this way. And so it's and there's a part of it where it's our responsibility to actually think in this way, because it is you have to consider those things. You can't consider whether something's worth it without considering those things.
They're always weighing risks. When you're in public policy, it's not like you have a no risk option that you can default to.
Right.
It's I do this, I have these risks. I don't do anything, and these are the risks. And so it's always weighing those options. But then on top of that, you've got to say, that's how I think about risks. How do my consumers think about risks? How do the people I answer to think about risks? How does the populace think about risks? What are their fears right now? And then based on that, we'll push something out. And I can't think that the director of the WHO is doing anything different than that when he's declaring this emergency, this international state of emergency over 5 deaths and 17,000 infections.
Right.
And in certain things, they've declared these for, like SARS and stuff, where you have, a 60% death rate. And so the deaths aren't that many, but they go, if this catches, it's going to be really bad. But in this case, it took a long time. The deaths aren't bad. So it's, but
They
like
know
you
the
said,
vector,
you always
they
have
know
to
what
weigh these.
caused
They
it.
know the vector, they know these things. And so they always have to weigh these things. But the politics in it is incredibly significant. And it's really important for people to not allow people to stir up fear in them that's just not founded. And I'm kind of surprised when you said in your office that some people talked to you about it, because, it's not like a risk. But yet
Somebody in Raleigh got it.
there's a homosexual
That was
community in
the way
Raleigh.
the conversation started.
Right. And the point is that it needs to start to be, wait a second, let's be afraid of what we should be afraid of, and let's not just let people stir us up with fear. Because that's why I think part of it is about power, because they're working so hard to stir up a false fear, a fake fear. But yet the people, we're so badly educated in math because, one of the reasons is, you have a lottery and stuff, and you don't want people to be educated in probability, because if they are, nobody will play the lottery and you won't get your funding. And so, that's half a joke, but only half a joke, because there's
Right.
real financial incentives not to teach basic probability anymore.
Right.
So people look at it and they go, okay, so it's in the homosexual community, but I could get it. Well, shouldn't you wait until non-homosexuals start to get it first before you panic about it? But they're pushing really hard to
You
create
have
that
more
panic
chances
now.
to get monkeypox than you do winning the lottery.
We need to remember that these people have been around for a while, have been playing this game for a while. Fauci was the one, he became prominent because he was leading the response about AIDS.
When was that?
I think 83 is what this is from.
Okay.
As you know, this syndrome has been evolving over the past several months. It seems that as every month or even week goes by, we learn a little bit more about how it can go out of its original epidemiological constraints. Early on, as you know, the disease was felt to be limited to the male homosexual community and then the IV drug users, and then we began to see that groups like Haitians, hemophiliacs, the implications of possible transmission via blood transfusions. When you have a situation that we're seeing here with this recent article by Oleski, in which children, household contacts of either individuals with AIDS or individuals at high risk for AIDS, have indeed, at least a significant number of them, have what looks like a syndrome that's identical to AIDS syndrome, that tells you that it's quite possible that just intimate contact outside of the sexual contact blood transmission route is a possible mechanism whereby this disease can be transmitted. If that's the case, then indeed the implications for the spread to even other groups besides infants and children become something that needs to be reckoned with. So I think it is going to have a major impact on our thinking about what the real confines of the syndrome will be.
So Fauci made predictions that 10% of all Americans would die of AIDS. Even though it never really left the homosexual community. So when you have the WHO director saying the same thing, we need to learn that they play this game a lot. This isn't the first time. Fauci did it, in, 1983. And so, they'll keep playing this as long as it works. And they keep going, but this could happen. You don't know. This could happen. And children
And that's not science.
And that's not science. And children didn't really get it. I mean, it wasn't true what he said there. It was transmitted by blood. They said that you had to like wipe off all the doorknobs, and that during the AIDS thing in '83, they were telling you have to wipe everything that they said for COVID. And then with COVID, they found out later, no, it can't transmit that way after they get everybody to wipe everything down with Clorox all the time. And the same thing with AIDS. They said you could get it from doorknobs. That was Fauci. And so we just need to recognize that they love to fearmonger, and they love to stir it up, and they try to make it bigger than it is because it is a power play.
We take everything back to this, but I mean, there's God's sovereign and God's in control. I mean, we did an episode on mental illness, and we need to do one on, I think we should do one at some point just on sickness in general. But there's a part of it where we need to acknowledge that everything comes from the hand of God. And it doesn't mean that, obviously, when you sin, God can punish you with, sickness is one of the things that God uses to chasten people. It doesn't mean that every single time someone gets sick, it means that they did some particular sin to cause them to get sick. But God says that he uses it. Deuteronomy 28:58-61. If you do not carefully observe all the words of this law that are written in this book, that you may fear the glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring upon you and your descendants extraordinary plagues, great and prolonged plagues, and serious and prolonged sicknesses. Moreover, he will bring back on you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, and they shall cling to you. Also every sickness and every plague which is not written in this book of the law will the Lord bring upon you until you are destroyed. God's really clear here. He can cause sicknesses to come upon places. He can cause plagues that they've never heard of. He can cause plagues that have been thought to have been eradicated, or thought you haven't had them, they haven't been even heard of in a long time, and they come back. And he says he can do this, and he says he will do this. And there's this temptation at times to think, because we live in a modern world, that God doesn't use these means anymore. And there's no reason to believe that. There's no reason to think that. He's very clear that he does this, and there's no reason to believe that the world has changed. God is still in control of the world, and he does this at times.
And it even says in there very specifically, of which you were afraid.
Right.
And one of the big problems is that because as a nation we don't fear God anymore, it means you can stir up all kinds of fears about other things, even things that are completely irrational fear. If you're not in the homosexual community, there's no evidence at all that you need to be concerned in the least little bit about monkeypox. It requires quite a bit of contact is what all the evidence is at this point. And so to turn around and go, oh, we should be afraid of this. But there's a bunch of people that are already afraid of it. And they're afraid of it because they don't fear God, so they're going to fear diseases. They're going to fear sickness. They're going to fear all these other things. And we just need to recognize how destructive it is when you have a nation that doesn't fear God. And the church has stopped preaching the fear of God, and we're doing a great disservice to the nation. Because a nation that doesn't fear God is going to fear everything else. A nation that doesn't fear God is going to get all these diseases and all these plagues, and they're going to panic over the plagues. And, the center of this is, Christendom. It's the West, it's Europe, it's America. It's these nations that should fear God. It hasn't, exploded that much in Africa. Africa has an endemic in some countries, but it hasn't exploded much in Africa. It's in Europe and in the U.S., and we should look at that, and we should just recognize what's going on.
And this passage we just read tells us, like I said, if we do fear God, what we'll do is we'll keep his law.
Right.
And it's his law is not onerous. His law is not this burden that he's it's kind of like you go and, I've had times where I come inside and one of my children is sulking. And what is wrong? Well, I'm scared you're going to spank me. And it's like,
what did you do wrong?
Right. And why are you scared you're going to spank me? Because if you're going to spank me. And I'm like, well, just do the things I've asked you to do. Do the things I've told you to do that aren't hard, that aren't impossible. I'm not demanding ridiculous things of you. And there's this part of it where people look at, they don't want to fear God. And if they do want to fear God, they want to just sit around and pout and sulk because God won't let them do the things that they want to do. And God says, do the things I've told you. They'll exalt you. They'll protect you. They'll bless you. But if you are determined to do the things I've told you not to do, you should expect that my wrath will be upon you. My judgment will be upon you.
Right? It's, important in for when looking at diseases like this to call sin sin. And it doesn't mean that you don't treat, sexually transmitted diseases that you shouldn't get if you're, a husband and wife who are chaste with each other. If that's what the population is composed of, there's a whole category of diseases that do not spread. Doesn't mean that you don't treat them, but if you call sin sin, it changes things, and it changes your response in a lot of ways.
So we read this passage from Deuteronomy. It's just a short excerpt from a long list of curses that Moses is communicating to the people about how God will deal with them if they stray from his law. And I mean, these ones are talking about some pretty severe sicknesses, and the whole thrust of our podcast is, this one's not actually that bad. So if this is the judgment of God, you could either say it's relatively light, or you could say it's relatively pointed. But go read the rest of Deuteronomy 28, and you see all of the other things that God uses in his toolkit to give his judgment on his people. And one of the ones that is throughout that chapter is God gives the people fear.
Right.
And sometimes those fears are rational because he's doing terrible things to them. And other times those fears are irrational because God's giving them over to fear. He's giving them over to fear of things that they ought not to be afraid of.
And once you stop fearing God, you give yourself over to fear.
Once you stop fearing God, you're going to fear anything.
Right.
You become very vulnerable to fear. And that in and of itself is a judgment of God. And so if we're reading those news stories and we're afraid without the requisite rationalization for being afraid, then we need to step back and say, okay, I don't have the disease, but I've got something else that's also the judgment of God.
And all those things, right? I mean, because you look at that passage in Deuteronomy 28, it goes from being destroyed by armies to having mildew, right? I mean, God can express his wrath at all different kinds of levels. But all of them are supposed to remind you of the same thing, is that you need to obey God, right? Because it's really, that's the pattern is, because you won't obey his commandments, then he's going to do this. Because you won't obey his commandments. I mean, the first third of the chapter is, if you obey his commandments, then, your kneading bowl will always be full. You'll never be barren. You'll never miscarry. I mean, it's like different levels of promises of blessings.
But short and beautiful. Like
But short and
everything you could
beautiful.
want.
Right. Well, not everything that modern Americans could want, but everything that righteous people should desire. But when you look at it, like you said, I mean, God judges with all different kinds of levels. And the main thing that we're supposed to take away is, when we see this, the church has to stop being so afraid. So that we say, this is a result of sin. This is what God is doing. And, during the AIDS epidemic, there were some pastors that came out and said that, and they got, there were members of churches. The church that I was in at the time, people were going, how could they say that? And the reality is, well, that's what God says. That's how you can say it. And is it just exclusive to the homosexual community because God's judging the homosexuals? That's sure what it looks like. Let's stop pretending like we have to blind ourselves, instead of saying, yes, the whole society has sin, but if what we do instead is embrace the sin and say that we need to deal with it at a societal level, rather than dealing with the specific judgment that God's giving, there's a sense that you're approving of what they're doing and you're asking for judgment upon yourself.
Right. And there's a part of it where, I mean, we forget that judgment is just a decision. You know what I mean? I mean, just in the sense of, this is literally what is your judgment in the matter? And it's just, what is your decision in the matter? And so, in a sense, I mean, everything becomes the judgments of God. And so when God sends, when the coronavirus came, we didn't necessarily know exactly what God was. We couldn't sit back and go, it's clear that God is judging because of X. But God clearly judged to send the coronavirus across the world. That was a decision that God made. And when you divorce it and go, God decided it for no reason, that doesn't make any sense.
I mean, one thing that's dangerous, that is what WHO is doing, it is what CDC did now and has done in the past, is instead of saying that sin should have consequences, and this isn't saying that you don't treat them, but you have to announce sin has consequences or sin doesn't get constrained. And so they act like they're trying to help the homosexual community by what they're doing, but what they're really doing is they hate the homosexual community, even as they're trying to obey it and trying to do what it wants to do. Because they don't want to say, here's what's destroying you, stop it. Instead, they want to say, no, it can't be that. And that really is a form of hatred.
They are saying, hey, you should limit your sexual partners. You should, I mean, there are these.
Don't pick up any new ones.
Right. There is a judgmentless constraint. They're trying to constrain it solely for the purpose of constraining the disease, but in the end, like you said, they have
limited.
They have no interest whatsoever in constraining the activity, and there is no willingness whatsoever to look at it and say. I mean, and you have to understand, medicine does not do this in other areas. If you go to your doctor will tell you, you need to cut this out of your life. This is killing you. They know that the homosexual lifestyle shortens life. And there is this part of it where they are very unwilling to address it. And so even from just a objective, this is going to cause you, this activity and these things can cause you to die, they're not willing to address it, but they're very willing to address it in other areas.
But not to the right level and not societally to the right level. People who commit suicide, there's not a clear acknowledgement that this is a serious sin that has serious consequences. And things like, with COVID, you saw where they were really downplaying the effect that gluttony, obesity has on the people who are dying of COVID. It was, it was out there, but it wasn't. They weren't really talking about it very much. And you go down the list of other sins that have real physical consequences that get papered over.
And so we should just recognize that the government tries to mitigate the effects of sin. And the reason they can get away with it is because the church isn't saying there's effects to sin. And if the church isn't shining light and saying there's real effects to sin, then the government's incentive to keep that voting population behind them is to just work to mitigate the effects of sin instead of eliminating it. Because it really starts with the church. Does the church shine the light in the dark places, or does it let the dark places remain dark? As long as the dark places are going to remain dark, they will stumble around like blind men, thinking that they can solve it. But the reason that they never will, like with AIDS, where they go spend years trying to solve it and get nowhere, it's because the church isn't going, you need to deal with the sin. And the church has to have enough faith in God to say that. We talked about monkeypox because this is something that's going on where the world is looking at it completely wrong. They're looking at it and making suppositions and saying that things are going to happen that they have no evidence that they'll happen. But the reason they do this is because they're walking in their sin. They're walking blind to the truth. They're walking without fear of God. And the church should just recognize how culpable it is for not speaking to these issues and remaining silent and not speaking to the need that the whole society needs to fear God, that God is a God to fear. And if you talk about something like AIDS, if you talk about something as relatively minor as monkeypox and say, this is the judgment of God and you better fear that God, that's how our society improves. And the church needs to start speaking instead of remaining silent. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.